Assalamu alaikum. Part 2 of this lecture is elementary programming. So now that we have completed the first part, we know how to write our first program. We understand how we write a Java program, that we have to define a class and we define a name for it, we give it a name, and that we have to have a main method, and then within the main method we can write any commands that we want to execute. So here we want to compute the area, which is a program that you have already done in Python and C++. We just want to show you how it would be written in the syntax of Java. So we start by saying public class, and then we give the class a name. We decided that the name is compute area, and as we've said, the convention is to write capital letter for the first word and the second word if it's the name of a class. And then we write the same statement, public static void, main string args, and then we open a curly braces. And then how do we compute the area? We need a radius, we need a area variable. So we define two variables, both are double, same syntax as C++, and then we initialize the radius to 20, and then we calculated the area, which is equal to the radius times the radius, which is the radius squared, times, and this is the value of pi. And then we want to print, so we will type system.out.println, and we open a parenthesis, the area of the circle of the radius is, and then we type the area. So this part is exactly the same as if you would write it in C++, only this part is different. These three statements are different. So if we want to see the output, we can run this code. And if you remember, as I said, if I were to use the same name as this class, then that means I have to create a new file called compute area. So if I don't want to create a new file, then I will not copy the class name. I will just type it this way. So the output will be, if the radius is 20, then the area is 1256.636. But if I want to create this class with the name compute area, then I will have to create a new Java file. I will create a new project for this file, and I will name it compute area. And then I can copy and paste. Oh. Since the class name is the same as the file name, it will work. If I decided to mistakenly not change the file name, so let's say for example, here I used compute area, but I didn't change the file name, it will give me an error and it will not allow me to run the program. Let's say I run it, it will crash. And you can see also here that it tells you that you have to change the file name for it to run successfully. So I hope now you get the hang of how to use Java. It will be more clear as we continue on with our lectures, because we'll talk about what object-oriented programming actually means in upcoming lectures, so all of this syntax will be more clear. So variables are identifiers for those variables. What are the conventions in Java? They are the same conventions as they are in C++ with addition to the class name convention. So an identifier is nothing but a sequence of characters that consists of letters, digits, underscores, and dollar signs. It cannot start with numbers. An identifier, as with C++, it cannot be a reserved word, so you cannot use, for example, true, false, null, for example, any of the words that are reserved for the language. And an identifier can be of any length. It is not specific to 20 characters, for example, not specific to 30 characters. It can be of any length. So here we have an activity. If we want to compute the area of when we have the radius equals to 1, and then we can train the radius to equal to 2, and then you can see the output. So here we used two variables. The identifiers are radius and area. The same two variables were used here. So the name of the variables are radius, area in both examples. So how do we declare variables? It is the same way as we used to use it in C++. Declaring a variable, we start first with the data type, and then we decide on a variable name, or as we call it, an identifier. So int x, double radius, char a, and then an assignment statement will look like this. And then of course we end with a semicolon. An assignment statement we will start with the variable name is equal to the value that we want to assign to this variable name, and then we end it with a semicolon. What if we want to declare and assign and initialize at the same statement? We will write it this way. We will write int x is equal to 10, semicolon, but without the capital. This is a typo. And also here. And also here. So we will write int x is equal to 10, semicolon. If the value is double, it will be double radius is equal to 3.49, char a is equal to capital A, and we end it with a semicolon. So what about declaring a constant? How do we declare a constant in Java? In C++, we would write const, and then the data type, the variable name, and then we give it a value. What about in Java? In Java, we will say final instead of const, and then the data type, and then the constant name, and then we give it a value, or we assign it to a value. Why should we declare and initialize at the same time? Why can't we just declare a final variable and then initialize it along with the code? Why does it have to be at the beginning? Well, because when we write it in two statements, so let's say, for example, if we write it final, and then let's say it's an integer, and the integer variable's name is x, and then we give it a value later on in the code, let's say statement 5, and this is statement 1, and we give it a value of 10. This is not allowed. We cannot write this code. It has to be this way. We have to write final, and then the data type, and then the variable name is equal to a value. We can't write it this way. Well, why? Why can't we write it this way? Because when we define a constant variable, it means that the value here cannot change. And if we don't give it a value, if we don't say assign it to 10 from the beginning, then that means that in our memory, the variable x will be assigned to something. It has to be. So if we don't give it a value, it will give it a default value or a garbage value in other languages. So the default value will be 0. So this will be the constant value. So then at line 5, it cannot be changed because this is the final value. It is a constant. So that is why it must be initialized during declaration, and you cannot change it within the code, and you cannot write it this way. So this is the syntax. And then the naming convention. We have to choose a meaningful and descriptive name. It has to be, the variable starts with lowercase. We know that it's, the convention is to use camel case, which is lowercase for the first word, and then the beginning of the second and third, and the rest of the words start with a capital letter, and then all of the other letters are small. What about classes? So this is about normal variables, and then here we talk about classes. As I said, the classes, we start with a capital letter for the first word and every other word. Constants, the same as we're used to in C++. The constants are written all caps, and if they're different words, then we add a underscore between them. So now we're going to dissect the output statement. So in an output statement or a print statement, we write it as system.out.print, and then we write the statement that we want to write. So what exactly are these system.out.print? System, it is a final class. It is a class in Java. We will look more into detail on what are classes and how can we use classes, but in simple terms, it is just a class. And within that class, we have a static member, which is called out because we want to output. And this output will be printed on the screen. What is going to be printed on the screen? Java World, for example. So it displays on the screen whatever we want to display to it. And we can use either print or we can use print line. If we use print, then the cursor will be at the end of that statement. If we use print line, then it will go to another line. So for example here, if we write system.out.print 1 and then system.out.print 2, it will print 1, and then right after it will be printing 2, and then if we write print line 3, it will print 3, and then the cursor will be moved to the next line. In this example, we wrote system.out.print line 1, so it will print 1 and then go to the next line. And then system.out.print line 2, it will print 2 and then move to the next line. And then system.out.print line 3, it will print 3 and then move to the next line. So if we have another output, it will be starting from here. And if we just write system.out.print line, it will just write a print line, or it will just move the cursor from its original starting point one line lower. Now, what if we want to read from the user? To read from the user, it is not as simple or as easy as we've seen it in C++. We have to create what we call a scanner object. So scanner is a class, and we have to create an object of that class, and we call it, for example, input. You can call it whatever name you want, but we will call it input. So we will use this object by saying scanner, which is the class name, input is equal to a new scanner, and then here's what is important. Between parentheses, we have to say that we want it from system.in. What does that mean? It means that we want it from the keyboard. It can be read, information can be read to our program from different sources. It can be from a file, it can be from a database, it can be from different types of source inputs. We want it to be from the keyboard. So we have to use system.in, which means that from the system, we want the input as opposed to system.out, which we see here. And then what if we want to read from this input? So this creates an object. After writing this statement, it creates an input object which allows me to read and write. It allows me to read files from the read information from the user. So how am I going to use this object? We will use it by, first we have to prompt the user to tell the user what we want them to enter. So the normal syntax is to print something to the user. So we will write system.out.print, enter a double value, and then we will create this object. Here we created this object. Now we're going to use this object, this input object that we created. Now we're going to use it, and we will select the data type that we are expecting the user to enter. If I want the user to enter a double, then I will use the input objects method that allows us to receive a double. So the way that we write this method is dot next double. And then here we will wait, or our program will wait for the user to enter a double value, and then this double value that will be entered, let's say the user entered 5, for example, this 5 will be stored in a double variable called d, and it will store this value of 5. What if I don't want to read a double? What if I want to read, for example, an integer? What if I want to read a floating point? What if I want to read text? Here we have different methods for each type, each data type that I want to read. So if I want to read a byte, I will say input.next byte. If I want to read a short, next short. If I want to read an integer, next int, and so on and so forth. So here it tells you that Java reads the data as a string. So when it's used in input, it'll be stored first as a string, and then using these methods will turn them into the data type that we want them to be. So if we want, it will basically cast the string into whatever data type that I choose using the method of my choice. So if I want the data to be, for example, a double, then I have to use this method. Without using this method, the input will be a string, and then it will be casted into a double, and then we can store it in a normal variable as a double. فبالعربي اللي سويناه هنا انه احنا تكلمنا عنها بالعربي. طيب نبدأ من هنا. لما نبغى نقرأ من اليوزر، احنا تكلمنا عن في البارت الأول، تكلمنا عن لو كنا نبغى اليوزر ينطبع له معلومة، فراح نستخدم system.out.print java world. طيب ايش معناها؟ ايش معنى هذه system.out.print؟ تفاصيلها راح نركز فيها في الأسابيع القادمة لما راح نتكلم عن ايش معنى object وايش معنى class. لكن بشكل مبسط، system هذا عبارة عن class. السيستم كلاس داخله في out اللي هو يعتبر member من السيستم كلاس. طبعا ايش معنى out؟ هو basically outstream، يعني شيء نبغى نطبعه او نسوي له output لليوزر. طيب ايش نوع الاوتبوت؟ print، يعني معناها انه انا ابغى اطبعها لليوزر على الشاشة، بعدين احدد الجملة اللي انا ابغى اطبعها. طيب لما ابغى input من اليوزر، لما ابغى اليوزر يكتب لي معلومة، فبالتالي انا راح احتاج في الجافا مختلف شوي عن في السي بلس بلس وعن البايثون، اني انا لازم اسوي statement، وهذه statement معناها انه انا ابغى اطبع او عفوا انا ابغى اخذ نص من اليوزر، لازم اكتب هذه statement تعبر عن هذه المعلومة. فطريقة كتابتها انه راح نقول سكانر اللي هو عبارة عن كلاس، وراح اعطي object من هذا السكانر اسم وراح نسميه input. ممكن يكون أي اسم، يعني مثلا هنا مثال ثاني عطاك اسمها SC، ممكن تعطينها أي اسم F L G whatever. بعدين راح تقولين new scanner اللي هو من نفس الداتا تايب، نفس الكلاس تايب. بعدين بين قوسين راح تقولين system.in. ايش معنى system.in؟ معناها انه انا راح اقرا المعلومات. السكانر معناها انا راح اقرا معلومه، وهذا الفاريبل اللي راح استخدمه للقراءه. بعدين هنا حددنا انه system.in، هذه معناها انه انا راح اقرا من وين؟ من فايل، من داتابيس، من وين راح اقرا المعلومه؟ system.in معناها راح اقراها من الكيبورد. فالسيستم input زي ما احنا هنا استخدمنا system.out بعدين print عشان نطبع للشاشة، هنا system.in معناها راح استخدم الكيبورد. فهذه الستيتمنت اللي راح نستخدمها لازم نكتبها متى ما احتجت اني انا استخدم سكانر. ولازم طبعا راح نشوفها بعد شوي لما اوريكم اياها في لاب صغير، راح اوريكم كيف نسوي لها import. لانها هي من مكتبة فلازم نسوي import للمكتبة عشان اقدر استخدمها. طيب فالحين انا عرفت هذا الاوبجكت اللي اسمه input اللي راح استخدمه الان. كيف استخدمه؟ اول شيء لازم اقول system.out.print عشان اقول لليوزر ايش انا ابغاه يكتب قبل لا اطلب منه كتابة شيء. فهنا طلبنا منه انه يكتب a double value. بعدين عرفنا هذا الاوبجكت، وبعدين الان بدينا نستخدم هذا الاوبجكت. فلما استخدمنا هذا الاوبجكت اللي اسمه input، على حسب نوع الاوتبوت اللي او على حسب نوع الانبوت اللي انا ابغى اليوزر يدخله راح اكتب الميثود. انا عندي هنا مجموعة methods على حسب نوع الانبوت. انا ابغى اليوزر يدخل دبل فراح اكتب input.next double. فهذا ايش راح يحصل الان؟ input هو افتراضيا او باي ديفولت اللي دخله اليوزر راح يكون string، و implicitly او على حسب انا اي method استخدم راح يسوي لها تحويل من السترينج الى النوع اللي انا راح استخدمه. فمثلا لو قلت .next double راح يحولها الى double، كتبت next byte راح يحول اللي دخله اليوزر الى بايت. طبعا اذا انا حطيت انواع مختلفة راح يعطيني error، يعني مثلا لو انا حطيت حروف في دبل راح يعطيني مشكلة. فانا لازم اطلب من اليوزر يدخل داتا تايب، بعدين على حسب الداتا تايب راح يحفظ. فراح اقول input.next double، بعدين هذا راح يعطيني قيمة من اليوزر. لنفترض ان اليوزر عطاني قيمة 5، ايش اسوي في هذه ال5؟ لازم احفظها في مكان، فراح احفظها في a variable لنفترض سميته d. طبعا لازم احدد الداتا تايب، راح اقول double d وراح اعطيها هذه القيمة 5. فكأنها صارت الان double d is equal to 5، بس انه اخذها من اليوزر فكتبت هذه الجملة. تمام؟ طيب فعلشان نمثلها لكم هنا راح نكتب system.out.print enter, for example, enter your date of birth مثلا، لا طويلة date of birth، مثلا enter your age. بعدها راح نعرف السكانر عشان نطلب من يسمح لليوزر انه يدخل. راح اسميها فقط n is equal to new scanner، بعدين system.in، بعدين راح استخدم هذه system.in بما انه راح يدخل لي age، فراح افترض انه integer، راح اقول int age is equal to n.next int. فراح اسوي لها run. الحين راح ياخذ مني age وراح يصير build successful. عفوا هي هذه البروجرام. لو أنا أبغاه يطبع لي إنه my age is whatever فراح نقول هنا خليها print line عشان يطبع لي إياها in another line. Your age is age. فهنا لو مثلا كتبنا 27 قال لك your age is 27. فهذا عبارة عن الانبوت والاوتبوت. هو يمكن الشيء الجديد عليكم في الجافا اللي كان مختلف عن السي بلس بلس. So data types, we have two different ways. We have we have two different types of data. Sorry. We have primitive types and we have reference types. The primitive types are the basic data types. And the first primitive type is Boolean, which is either true or false. And then we have numeric, which are character, and we write it as char, and integers, which or integral, which are integers and floating points. And then the floating point, we have two types, double and float, depending on the size. Double is usually larger in size than float. And then the integers, we have four categories. It can be byte, it can be short, and then it can be int, and then long, depending on the size in bytes. The reference type includes more or additional types that were not part of the primitive types. So if we create our own data type, that is going to be part of the reference type. So it includes class types, interface types, and array types. We will look into that in later lectures. So what are the primitive data types? We have the byte, which is assigned integer. The size of it is 8 bits because it's a byte. And then we have short, int, float, long, and double. I'm sure you all know this. Boolean and character. And what are the operators that we use in Java? They're the same operators that we used in C++. So we have arithmetic, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, modulus, and increment and decrement. And then we have the logical and, logical or, logical not, and we know what those mean. And we also have the comparison, which are 6 types. And we have the concatenation of strings. If we want to add a string to another string, we use the plus sign to concatenate between them. And then we know how to write the shorthand argumented assignment, which is plus and equal. If I wanted to change the same variable with an additional, for example, 8, then these two are equivalent. Now we'll move on to typecasting. We have two different types of typecasting, implicit and explicit typecasting. Implicit means that we don't write it explicitly. We don't write it like this way. So implicit casting, an example of it is the following. We write the data type as double, and we give it a name D, and then we equal it to 3, which is written as an integer. What happens here is that it will be casted to double. So if I create the statement and then print the value of D, it will give us 3.0. And this we call it type widening, because we widen the type. It was an integer, which was 4 bytes, and then it turned into a double. So if we can see here, an integer is 32 bits, and it became 64 bits. So the type was widened. The space that was reserved for this number is widened into the space reserved for a double. Explicit casting is when we write it explicitly. We write between parentheses the new data type that we want it to be casted to. So for example, here 3.0 is written as a double. If we wanted to cast it into an int, we have to write it this way. And this will be 3, and it will be stored in int I. So this we call type narrowing, which is the opposite. Int I is equal to int 3.9, and if we turn this into an integer, here it didn't matter because 3.0 is the same as 3, but here the value of 3.9 will not be round, it will be truncated. This value will be removed. So 3.9 will be only 3 when we cast it and store it into an integer. So what about this statement? Is this statement correct? Will this statement be compiled? I'll give you a minute to think about it. Or you can pause the video. So this statement is incorrect because here in the right hand side, we know that 5 divided by 2.0 in terms of data types, they are different. And because at least one of them is double, so the answer of this calculation, of this division, will be a double, which is 2.5. But I stored 2.5 in an integer without casting, which is larger in size. This will give me a compilation error. I have to cast it. So if you'd like to see this, if you write this statement in our Java compiler, it will give us a casting error. So we have to cast it, and then we can store it in X. And then the answer will be, pause the video before you see the answer, it should be 2. Because 5.2, although it's 2.5, because it was casted into int, the 0.5 will be truncated, and then the value will be only 2. So this is part 2 of this lecture. We will continue with part 3 in another video.